If we are talking about peak performance, we can't go past flow states. And essentially, a flow state is when you feel time kind of stops or doesn't exist. You're completely locked in a task that you're doing, and essentially nothing around you really matters. When I try to get into flow, the first thing I try to do is that I block out time with no interruption. Basically, lock yourself in those periods when you're focused on getting in the flow. You can't force it. Now, a lot of times when you want to get into flow, it's a bit like meditation. When you want to get into that meditative state, you sit down and you almost lock yourself in that position where you're thinking, I want to get into that meditative state where I'm nice and relaxed. And similarly to flow states, if you start overthinking it, you're never going to get into flow because there's just too much distraction out there. The moment you set yourself the task to do a certain activity, you have to be motivated, and also you have to have no distractions. But it's important you don't try to force it, because the moment you start forcing it, it just will never happen. When you're synchronized between your mind, your heart, and your body, you automatically go into that flow state. Your productivity goes up, which means you become laser focused and more efficient with your time, so you can get a lot more done in less time. Welcome back to Peak Performance Hacks, where we help you stay focused, energized, and on top of your game. And I am your host, Dr. Gan. If we are talking about peak performance, we can't go past flow states. And essentially, a flow state is when you feel time kind of stops or doesn't exist. You're completely locked in a task that you're doing, and essentially nothing around you really matters. And this is where you feel that you're productive and you're doing the best work that you can do. Now, it doesn't really mean that it has to be work. It could be a hobby that you enjoy. It could be a conversation where you're listening to someone else, or even listening to a podcast, for example. And it could also be when you're deep in thought. Now, to understand flow states, we have to know what it is, and it is also known as being in the zone. So if you've ever heard that, especially in sports, they talk about it a lot, where you're completely in the zone and you feel that everything is going and you can't really according to what you want, and you can't really put your finger to explain why it is so good. And a lot of athletes, for example, when they're in the zone, they're completely focused on what they need to achieve and what their goal is, and nothing else matters around them. Now, the real definition of flow is it's a state of being fully immersed in a task, feeling energized and focused in the process, and completely enjoying the experience. Now, you may be thinking that you probably have never been in a flow state, and I essentially was thinking about the same thing as well, because I remember when I was young and I was a kid and I played with a certain toy, or even when I was actually playing video games, when I was much older, you've been in that moment where you feel that you're engrossed in the game and nothing else really matters, and before you know it, 4 to 6 hours have just gone by. And when I'm in work as well, I go through this experience whereby I'm completely in that state where I'm in flow and I'm concentrated on the goal that I want to achieve for my patients. So another example would be when you're driving and you kind of know the destination where you're going to go to, and you start off, you get in your car, and all of a sudden you're listening to something, or you're even having a conversation with a friend or a loved one, and the next moment you're at the destination. You can't remember if you're going past traffic lights, you can't remember braking, and you're completely in the flow of what you're actually doing. Now, I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't be concentrating on the road, but all I'm suggesting is that because you knew the location, you went into an automatic flow state and focused on the other bits that you were actually thinking about or even listening to. For the longest time, people have accessed flow states through spiritual and religious experiences. Abraham Maslow, a famous psychologist who kind of brought the hierarchy of needs, also brought our attention to flow states, and he essentially felt that when you were in a good flow state, it brought us closest to our identities. And then another psychologist, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, really brought flow states to the forefront of what we know it as it is now. He had a more simplified version of flow states whereby he felt that if you had the skill set and you applied it to a challenging goal, you would reach your flow state. So essentially, if you knew how to perform a certain action and it was challenging enough for you, you will enter flow because you'll be concentrating on the activity. Now, when you start any activity, especially when the skill is not there, it can be quite daunting and even quite boring. As you develop more skills, the task then becomes more engaging, and intrinsically, you're motivated to actually perform this task. His basis worked well that when you had the skill set and the task was demanding, you enter into this deep flow. And essentially, my take on it is that no matter how challenging an activity is, if you're actually motivated to actually perform the task, no matter if it's a hard task or it's something you haven't even learned yet, you would be interested to perform it and you will potentially get into flow. But you really have to be interested in the idea of performing the activity. But you might be asking, like, how can you actually get into flow a lot more often, especially if you find that you're distracted all the time and you can't really concentrate? According to me, in order to get into flow, you needed certain components or criterias to be met before you can get there. The first one being you have to have clear goals and are motivated and rewarded by the task. So if it's a boring task or it's something that you're not sure about, you're not going to get into flow. You have to have high concentration and no distractions. So therefore, no screens around you, no phones around you, nothing that could distract you. You have to lose yourself in the activity and also lose your self-consciousness. So essentially, it's not about you anymore. It's not about time. It's not about being right or wrong. And you're completely engrossed in the activity. You have to have a clear feedback loop as well. You have to know whether you're on track or you're actually steering off track. So this is important because if you find that you're going around in circles and you're not actually achieving your goals or your tasks, you can then get distracted again and feel like you're not heading in the direction you want to go. And you have to have a balanced skill set to challenge ratio. What this essentially means is that it can't be too challenging and it can't be too easy. And if it's either too hard or too easy, then you won't get into flow. Now, if it's too hard, you might get anxious and stressed. And if it's too easy, you will then go back into a self consciousness state whereby you think this is too easy, it's below myself, and there's this almost an element of a sense of entitlement here. So how does flow benefit performance? The easiest way I can describe it is that when you're synchronized between your mind, your heart, and your body, you automatically go into that flow state. Now, it's not about yourself, it's not about what's outside of you. You're essentially just focused on what you're actually doing. Your productivity goes up, which means you become laser focused and more efficient with your time, so you can get a lot more done in less time. You become a master at what you do. It's no longer about what others think, it's no longer about what you think. You're really lost in the creation process. You push yourself to the limits and you don't really think about what's not possible. You're thinking about what you want to achieve and you feel like you have this under control because you're almost a master in what you do. Think about the athletes training and performing in the zone. A lot of them actually do a lot of mind work whereby they're running the race in their heads before they even race or get on the track. And part of that reason is that they're trying to get themselves into that flow state psychologically and also physiologically within their body. And that's why the criteria is very important, because if you don't have the criteria, you'll often find that you get quite distracted and you can't get into the flow state. Now, one of the biggest factors in experiencing flow really comes down to your subjective experience of the action you're taking. Do you enjoy what you're doing? Is it appropriately challenging enough for you, or do you think it's too easy? Do you believe what you're doing is important? And this is a very important point, because if you think it's a menial task, you then make it about yourself. And again, you go back into this loop whereby you're not in flow. Are you happy in this moment and are you relaxed? Now, if you're anxious, if you're angry with something, you're never going to get into flow. In our current life, and also I would say our work model, there's so many distractions out there, between phones ringing, computers going on, lots of distractions, people calling you, commitments, whether it be family, life, and everything else in general. Now, not to mention that inner voice that's kind of telling us that we're not good enough, that you can't do the task, that you're not smart enough. There's all this other chatter that comes in and essentially distracts you from reaching that state of flow. So these are some of my ways whereby I feel help me the most when I try to get into flow. The first thing I try to do is that I block out time with no interruption. And what I mean by that is I, I, I put myself in a position where I'm going to achieve these criterias without distractions. And that way, for me, I like to do things in the morning. So I wake up early because the kids aren't awake. It's nice, dark, and also quite silent at that time. But if you like the night or you prefer the nighttime, then you should look or basically lock yourself in those periods when you're focused on getting in the flow. And it doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be long, whether it's 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, even an hour, as long as you can get yourself in that position whereby you can completely concentrate and focus, that will help you get into the flow. The next one would be I would get organized about it. And what I mean by this is that I'm not going to wake up in the morning, sit at my desk, it's an activity at the desk, and start trying to work out what I'm going to do. I would essentially work out the night before what I'm going to be doing for the day. I usually plan things a week ahead, but I also get really focused the night before because I don't want to be wasting my time trying to organize what I'm going to be doing, so that the moment I sit down, I get straight into what I want to do in terms of the work, and I get into that flow state. The other thing that I do that really helps me is that I essentially have different desktops. So there's different screens whereby on one it could be work related, on another it could be related to something else, and I separate them. So when I get into these flow states where I'm going to sit down and focus on an activity, I have a desktop that is just catered specifically for the activity that I'm going to be doing. So it might be an empty screen with just a notepad where I can take notes or write if that's what I'm doing. And there's nothing else that I can do. There's also apps out there whereby you can block yourself or you can block notifications. You can do this on your Mac. You don't even have to purchase this, and or even on your Windows computer, whereby you basically block notifications and you can just focus on the work that you're doing. And I find that makes it a lot easier to get in the flow because there's just no interruptions there. The other thing you can do is if you don't need to use your computer, you can essentially just use a piece of paper and do work there. Now, it really depends on what the activity is. If it's something with your hands, or it's a hobby, or it's a task that you don't actually have to be sitting down, then obviously this probably won't pertain to you. But if it's an activity where it's related to work, where you need to actually think of ideas or develop ideas or work on something that you've been thinking about for a long time, then even doing it on paper might be something that would be easy because it will avoid all the distractions out there. Now, another thing that I find really helps is listening to music. Now, one way I do it is I wear noise canceling earphones, essentially blocking out everything around me, and I listen to really ambient music or binaural or binaural music, which are high frequency or different frequencies that are focused, that allow you to focus a lot better. And the reason I find this helps is it kind of blurs everything around me, and it doesn't make me too sleepy, but it does allow me to concentrate a little bit more and focus on the task ahead. So therefore, at some point, I kind of feel a little bit with the music. It kind of makes me a bit motivated, and it kind of feeds the heart a little bit. And now the important thing I would say as the next point is that you can't force it. Now, a lot of times when you want to get into flow, it's a bit like meditation. When you want to get into that meditative state, you sit down and you almost lock yourself in that position where you're thinking, I want to get into that meditative state where I'm nice and relaxed. And similarly to flow states, if you start overthinking it, you're never going to get into flow because there's just too much distraction out there. And so the moment you set yourself the task to do a certain activity, you have to be motivated, and also you have to have no distractions. But it's important you don't try to force it, because the moment you start forcing it, it just will never happen. Trying to work out exactly why it's not happening is pretty much being in your head. And again, you're having that self consciousness and looking at a Mihai's sort of criteria. Again, you're not going to get into your flow state. Now, prior to starting out any activity, it would be important to do some mindfulness or breathing. Now, I find this really helps because it sets you up. Now, if you're working at night or you're working in the morning, usually once you wake up, you're quite well rested. But one of the first things that come up to your mind are all the things that happened the day before, all the challenges that you need to deal with. And therefore, I feel that if you do some form of mindfulness or even a breathing practice, this will essentially put you in a state that calms down your nervous system and then relaxes you altogether. And this will then give you a higher chance of when you actually start working to get straight back into flow. Now, if you find a task too boring, you really need to connect with that part of you that decided to pursue this. You need to connect with that why, for a better word. And I hate using it because a lot of people find it lame. Find your why. Simon Sinek has talked about it a lot, but it's very important. No one does any activities unless you have a why. If you're learning a new hobby, there's a why there. If you need to study, you need to think about the why you're studying this. It might be very boring, and believe me, I've been through a lot of studying myself as a doctor, but you have to have the why of why you're doing it. You're studying so that you could be a doctor, for example. You're studying so that you could help people. You're studying a certain activity so that once you know this, then you could be the best in your industry and what you do. And so there has to be a higher purpose, because no matter what you do, if you start at the beginning level, which most people do, it's always going to be boring. It's always going to be challenging. And it's very easy for you to just say that I'm not going to be doing this. And if you know exactly what's actually motivating you or driving you, then no matter how challenging it's going to be initially, you will get to a point whereby you will then become a master at what you do. Reaching a flow state generally happens when you are relaxed and completely in alignment with your mind, your heart, and your body. And you will find that when you're in this state of flow, everything becomes a lot easier. Your productivity goes up, your efficiency goes up, and you end up being a lot more joyful. And the reason for this is that most people that want to get into flow and are trying to force it will be forcing it potentially for their work. But if you actually even focus on your hobbies that you enjoy, whether it be playing sports or other enjoys, whether it's working in the shed and building things, you'll find that the flow effect kind of flows on, pardon the pun, into other parts of your life, whether it be with your family, whether it be with your work as well, or your hobbies, if that's not what you started off initially. And I think that for most people, if you spend a little bit of time trying to aim to get into that flow state and get into that state whereby you feel everything is in alignment, you'll feel that your life just operates at a completely different level. This wraps up this episode of Peak Performance Hacks. All the links and resources are in the video description or in the resource section, whether it is on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you're watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a review so that more people can discover our podcast and it could benefit them as well. Until I catch you next time, speak soon.